An old man stands on the rocky coast of Patmos. Listening to the unveiling of the end of the world, John made a careless mistake. The apostle knew his biblical history perfectly. The deeper question is, why the Spirit of God intentionally and permanently deleted, for the entire chapter, the rogue priest has remained anonymous. But in the final verses of Judges 18, the historian finally reveals the name and the lineage of the man who sold out the covenant for a promotion. The true identity of this priest reveals exactly how deep the corruption had already gone, and it makes Dan's betrayal infinitely worse. The final verses of Judges 18 unveil the name of the mercenary priest who sold his calling for a tribal paycheck. The text identifies him as Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh. But if you look closely at the oldest Hebrew manuscripts, there is a striking visual anomaly. The Hebrew letter Nun, the N in Manasseh, is suspended slightly above the rest of the text. It was inserted later by ancient scribes. If you remove that single suspended letter, the true, original name appears. The rogue priest is not the grandson of Manasseh. He is the grandson of Moses. The scribes were so deeply embarrassed by this betrayal that they altered the spelling to protect the memory of Israel's greatest prophet. The spiritual decay within the tribe of Dan was so profound that the direct descendant of the man who carried the Ten Commandments down from Sinai is now carrying a stolen silver idol into the north, an original patriarch from the eternal census. Most Christians who know the name Dan associate the tribe with their most famous descendant, the muscle-bound, tragic hero Samson. This is the tragic trajectory of the tribe. But this trajectory is not just visible in their geography or their priesthood. It is perfectly embodied in the most famous individual Danite in the biblical record. He is a man who serves as a living, breathing microcosm of his tribe's entire history, Samson. Samson is literally given the title of judge. He is born with a divine mandate to begin delivering Israel from the Philistines. He is the answer to the problem introduced in Judges 1. The man equipped with supernatural strength to reclaim the coastal inheritance his ancestors abandoned. But look at how Samson actually lives. He acts exactly like the rest of his tribe. He possesses the raw strength to tear a lion apart with his bare hands. But he lacks the internal discipline to keep a single covenant vow. He refuses to lead an army and wage a holy war in the light. Instead, his tactics are entirely those of the serpent. He relies on secret riddles, deception, burning foxes, and lone wolf ambushes. Worse still, Samson constantly wanders back down into the Philistine valleys, not to conquer the enemy, but to sleep with them. He wants the easy pleasure of the coast without the spiritual fight of the inheritance. He compromises his Nazirite vow piece by piece, touching a dead carcass, drinking at feasts, and finally resting his head in the lap of Delilah. The parallel is devastating. Dan was called to conquer the Philistines. Or perhaps they recognized the famous geographic phrase used throughout the Old Testament, from Dan to Beersheba, marking the furthest northern boundary of the Promised Land, but chose a comfortable compromise in Laish. Samson was called to conquer the Philistines, but chose a comfortable compromise with Delilah. Both the tribe and the man abandoned their holy calling because they could not resist the path of least resistance. The end of Samson's life is a brutal, physical picture of Dan's spiritual condition. He is blinded, bound in bronze chains, and forced to grind grain in the dark of a Philistine prison. In a final, desperate act of chaotic strength, he pushes the pillars of the temple apart and dies in the rubble, alongside his enemies. Samson is buried in the dust. The most famous Danite is dead, having never fully liberated his people. But hundreds of miles to the north, the stolen silver idol remains standing in the quiet city of Dan. The tribe has settled into a comfortable, unauthorized religion, completely insulated from the heavy burdens of the covenant. For generations, that idol waits in the shadows. The stage is perfectly set. The serpent is simply waiting for a fractured kingdom, and a desperate new king who will realize that Dan's idolatry is the perfect political weapon. Centuries pass. The unified kingdom of David and Solomon finally shatters under the weight of political arrogance. In 1 Kings 12, the nation rips in half. A rebel leader named Jeroboam takes control of the 10 northern tribes. While the descendants of David hold on to the southern kingdom of Judah, Dan is supposed to be a foundational pillar of the nation. Yet, at the climax of the biblical narrative, they completely vanish. Jeroboam has won the political war, but he faces a terrifying geographical problem. The center of Israel's spiritual life, the temple, the Ark of the Covenant, and the brazen altar is located in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is deep in southern territory. Jeroboam calculates the risk. If his people continue to travel south 3 times a year to offer their sacrifices, their loyalty will eventually return to the southern king, and they will assassinate him. This is not a story about religious devotion. It is a story about political survival. Jeroboam needs a counterfeit religion to keep his citizens at home. In the heat of a royal forge, craftsmen melt down precious metals and cast 2 massive golden calves. Jeroboam presents these statues to the people with a devastating, familiar phrase, "Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." But he must place these idols strategically to intercept the worshippers. He places one in Bethel, at the southern border of his new kingdom, and he places the second idol in the extreme north. He places it in the city of Dan. Most readers assume Jeroboam chose Dan simply for geographic convenience. It was the northernmost bookend of his new empire. But step back and look at the deep spiritual architecture of this moment. Jeroboam did not introduce idolatry to the tribe of Dan. This omission in Revelation is not a clerical error. It is not a lost manuscript fragment or a stylistic choice. He merely capitalized on a rot that had been festering there for generations. When the heavy golden calf was dragged into the city and set upon its stone pedestal, the people of Dan did not riot. There were no priests tearing their garments in protest. Why? Because the ground was already perfectly prepared. This was the exact same city that had stolen Micah's silver idol and hired the grandson of Moses. For hundreds of years, Dan had practiced an unauthorized, convenient religion in the shadows. Jeroboam simply swapped their private silver idol for a state-sponsored golden calf. The private compromise of one tribe has now become the mechanism for national apostasy. This is the exact moment Jacob's deathbed prophecy reaches its tragic climax. The serpent in the dust has finally struck. By establishing the golden calf in their territory, Dan provides the poison that will eventually destroy the entire northern kingdom. The venom spreads. The rider falls backward. And the 10 tribes of the north are ultimately swept away by the Assyrian Empire, lost to history. Dan started by abandoning their God-given coastland because the Amorite chariots were too frightening. They end by hosting a golden idol that leads millions into spiritual exile. Small choices create deep ruts, and those ruts eventually become the highways of destruction. By the time of the later prophets, the name of Dan is no longer associated with a noble judge. It is entirely synonymous with false worship. It is the silent, devastating culmination of a centuries-long tragedy that the rest of the Bible has been quietly tracking just beneath the surface. The prophet Jeremiah writes in horror about the sound of enemy armies marching from the north, saying, "The snorting of their horses is heard from Dan. At the sound of the neighing of their stallions, the whole land quakes." The tribe has become a spiritual wasteland. But how does the Bible officially handle this betrayal? When the historians sit down to record the permanent ledgers of God's people, how do they treat a patriarch who poisoned the family tree? The prophets watch this corruption, and the ledgers of history begin to reflect the reality on the ground. The erasure of Dan does not begin in the book of Revelation. It begins much earlier, hidden in a list of names that most readers skip entirely. Open a Bible to the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles. To a modern reader, it looks like a barren desert of unpronounceable names, the longest continuous genealogy in Scripture. Most of us flip past these pages without a second glance. But in the ancient Near East, a genealogy was not merely a family tree. It was a property deed. It was proof of citizenship in the covenant. To have your name recorded in the temple scrolls meant that you belonged to the story of God. The chronicler is compiling this massive registry after the nation has returned from the devastating Babylonian exile. This is not ultimately a story about losing a geographic territory. It is a story about surrendering a spiritual identity. He is writing to remind a broken people of who they are. He spends nearly 100 verses meticulously tracing the royal line of Judah. He dedicates entire chapters to the priests of Levi and the warriors of Benjamin. He traces the lines of Issachar, Asher, and even the half-tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. But as you read through the tribes, a chilling editorial judgment emerges. Look for the tribe of Dan. Look for the tribe prophesied to judge the nation, the tribe of the mighty Samson. You will search the chapters in vain. In the exhaustive, sprawling family trees of 1 Chronicles 2 through 9, Dan is effectively ghosted. Depending on the manuscript tradition, they are either omitted entirely, or their lineage is reduced to a single, obscure, almost coded fragment that avoids even speaking the patriarch's name. The chronicler refuses to give them space on the scroll. This is not an accident of history or a lost page of parchment. The biblical historian is making a profound theological statement. For generations, the tribe of Dan wanted nothing to do with the heavy burdens of the covenant. They did not want to fight for their difficult inheritance in the south. They did not want the invisible God in Shiloh. Dan's history is a slow, generational slide of compromise. It is the story of a people who repeatedly chose an easy, unauthorized path. They wanted their own land, their own mercenary priest, and their own golden calf. And so, the chronicler simply honors their choice. Dan chose to separate themselves spiritually from Israel. Now, the biblical text separates them historically. Their spiritual death has caused a historical fading. The tribe that lived in the shadows of compromise is now being swallowed by the shadows of history. This reveals a terrifying truth about how God handles human rebellion. The omission of Dan in the book of Revelation is not a sudden, arbitrary punishment handed down at the end of time. It is not a plot twist in the final chapter of the Bible. Apostasy rarely works like that. God rarely snaps a branch off the tree with sudden violence. Instead, the branch refuses the sap, slowly dries out over seasons of neglect, and eventually falls away quietly in the wind. The blank space in Revelation is simply the final, eternal seal on a document that the tribe of Dan wrote themselves. They spent centuries walking away from God. And in the end, God let them walk. They erased themselves. But the erasure of an ancient tribe is not just a history lesson. The biblical writers did not preserve this tragedy merely to satisfy our curiosity about a missing name in a prophetic vision, over a difficult, God-given assignment. They are the tribe that introduced a lethal spiritual poison into the bloodstream of the nation, a poison that eventually, they preserved it as a mirror. The slow-motion vanishing act of Dan forces a deeply uncomfortable question. If an entire tribe can start with a divine prophecy, receive a God-given inheritance, and yet slowly walk themselves out of the kingdom, how does that mechanism operate today? How does this ancient tragedy confront the modern reader? To answer that, we have to look closely at the nature of their first fatal choice and the myth of the harmless compromise. Section 8. The myth of the harmless compromise. The tragedy of Dan is terrifying precisely because it is so ordinary. The tribe did not wake up one morning and consciously decide to betray the God of Israel. Spiritual death is rarely a sudden, dramatic fall off a cliff. It is almost always a slow walk down a gentle, comfortable slope. This is the myth of the harmless compromise. Apostasy does not begin with the grand, public rebellion of a golden calf. It begins in Judges chapter 1. It begins by looking at the iron chariots in the valley and deciding that God's assignment is simply too difficult. It begins when you convince yourself that the inheritance is not worth the blood, and that God surely wants you to have an easier, more peaceful life. Stopped their own heart. The Bible leaves Dan off the final list because, spiritually speaking, Dan had already erased themselves centuries earlier, in the hill country. Jacob prophesied that Dan would act like a serpent in the dust. The serpent does not declare open war. It waits in the shadows. It relies on the subtle, quiet injection of venom. When Dan retreated into the rocks, they were listening to the hiss of the snake. Up to this point, we have been looking at an ancient map. But now the question becomes deeply personal. What is the coastland you are currently tempted to abandon? What difficult, contested territory has God handed you? Perhaps it is a fractured marriage that requires radical, exhausting forgiveness. Perhaps it is a standard of integrity that is actively costing you professional advancement. Perhaps it is a calling that requires you to stand in the light and face public opposition, or a private sin that demands the grueling, daily work of repentance. God has handed you that territory. But the iron chariots are lined up. The enemy is intimidating. The fight is exhausting. The temptation is always to look for a Laish. The temptation is to retreat from the difficult obedience of the valley and find a quiet place where the walls are low, where the culture does not push back, and where the tension simply stops. Laish looks like peace. It feels like relief. The Apostle John, exiled and weather-beaten, is recording the final chapters of human history. In Revelation chapter 7, the apocalyptic storms briefly pause, and John witnesses a census. The blank space in Revelation is not just an academic puzzle for theologians to solve. It is a terrifying mirror for the modern reader. But the biblical text exposes it for what it truly is: unauthorized ground. When you abandon the difficult territory God has given, you inevitably settle for a territory He has not. And once you settle in Laish, the subsequent compromises come easily. You begin to collect your own silver idols, small comforts, secret habits, customized theologies that demand nothing of you. You hire your own priests' voices, authors, or friends who will validate your retreat and tell you exactly what you want to hear. You institutionalize the compromise until the golden calf feels completely normal in your living room. Look at the generational sequence. Dan retreated from the valley. Dan stole the idol. Dan accepted the calf. Dan disappeared from the census. Every small compromise feels pragmatic in the moment. It feels like a strategy for survival. But 1,000 small compromises eventually rewrite your spiritual DNA. What are you walking away from because it is hard? What are you tolerating because it is easy? The story of Dan warns us that what feels like an escape from pressure may actually be a resignation from the kingdom. We must face this ancient mirror honestly. The tragedy of this vanished tribe leaves us with a stark, glaring warning. It forces us to ask how a person, a family, or an entire community can start with the promises of God and slowly, but it also points us forward to the end of the age. Because while Dan abandoned their calling as the judge, the final scroll in Revelation reveals another judge who held his ground. And that changes the way we see the blank space entirely. We have traced the tragedy of Dan across thousands of years. It began with a mother's desperate hope in a quiet tent in Canaan. It fractured when a tribal army looked at iron chariots in the valley and walked away in fear. It calcified when they stole a silver idol and hired a rogue priest. It became permanent when they embraced the golden calf of a fractured kingdom. And it ended in a deafening silence on the rocky shores of Patmos. When you step back and look at the complete architecture of this biblical tragedy, 3 realities become painfully clear. First, spiritual death is rarely an assassination. It is almost always a slow suicide born of convenience. Second, the cost of avoiding the battles God has assigned is always higher than the cost of fighting them. And finally, this is not ultimately a story about losing a geographic territory. It is a story about surrendering a spiritual identity. The root of the tragedy was spoken over them before they ever drew a sword. Jacob prophesied that the tribe meant to be a noble judge. 1,000 small, seemingly harmless choices walk themselves completely out of the story. To understand the silence at the end of the world, would instead act like a serpent in the dust, a viper striking from the shadows. For centuries, Dan chose to embody the snake. They sought the easy path, the hidden strike, the comfortable compromise. But you cannot adopt the tactics of the serpent without eventually sharing the destiny of the serpent. When the Apostle John stands on the island of Patmos and records the sealed 144, Linlining, he is not just taking a census, he is witnessing the culmination of all things. Dan, the appointed judge of Israel, abandoned his post. But John is looking at the true and final judge. Jesus Christ was also given a difficult, agonizing inheritance. He faced an enemy far stronger than Amorite chariots. But Christ did not retreat into the hill country. He did not look for a peaceful Laish. He held his ground in the brutal light of Calvary. And in doing so, he did not merely bite the heel of the enemy, he crushed the head of the serpent entirely. The blank space on the final scroll is not a cruel trick played by a vindictive God. It is a testament to God's terrifying respect for human freedom. If you insist on walking away from his presence, if you repeatedly choose the golden calf over the covenant, he will eventually grant you exactly what you have chosen. But for you, the reader living today, that blank space is not a judgment. Understand how the compromise began. We have to rewind thousands of years, long before the golden calves were forged, long before Samson tore the temple. It is an act of profound, glaring mercy. It is placed in the text to wake you up. Look at the territory God has called you to hold. It may be exhausting, highly contested, and frightening, but it is yours. Do not abandon it for an easier life. Do not hire a counterfeit priest who tells you the compromise is acceptable. Do not bow to the golden calves of your culture just because everyone else has stopped fighting. Hold your ground in the light, because you were called to inherit the kingdom, not to settle in the dust. If this study helped you see the ancient patterns of Scripture more clearly, please subscribe and share it with someone who might be facing their own iron chariots today. Your support allows this channel to keep digging deep into the text. Until next time, hold fast to your inheritance, down. And long before the tribe abandoned their home for the north, the mystery of the vanished tribe begins in a quiet tent in Canaan, with a desperate mother, a newborn baby, and a disturbing prophecy about a snake by the roadside. The story of Dan begins in a bitter, claustrophobic family rivalry. In Genesis chapter 30, Rachel, the favored wife of Jacob, is trapped in the agony of barrenness, desperate to compete with her fertile sister Leah. Rachel pushes her servant Bilhah into Jacob's tent. When Bilhah gives birth to a son, Rachel immediately claims the child as her own personal victory. She names him Dan. In ancient Hebrew, Dan translates directly to judge, or he has vindicated. The root word carries the weight of legal authority, governance, and divine justice. It is a divine roll call of the sealed 144, 000 servants of God, drawn directly from the 12 tribes of Israel. Rachel declares, God has judged my case. From his very first breath, this child is handed a noble, elevated identity. He is meant to be a pillar of justice, a leader who will stand upright, rule and defend his people for decades. That identity seems secure. But as Jacob lies on his deathbed in Genesis 49, gathering his sons to prophesy over their futures, the destiny of Dan takes a sudden, disturbing turn. At first, Jacob's blessing confirms the mother's hope. The patriarch says, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. But Jacob does not stop there. In the very next breath, the prophecy collapses into a dark and dangerous image. Jacob declares, Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a horned viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels so that its rider falls backward. This is a shocking and violent transition. Step back and look at the deep tension hidden within these two verses. A judge is a figure of the light. A judge operates in the public square, upholding the law, fighting enemies face to face, and establishing order for the vulnerable. But a serpent operates in the shadows. The specific Hebrew imagery here refers to a venomous desert viper known for burying itself in the sand. Perfectly camouflaged, it does not possess the raw, open strength of Judah's lion. or Benjamin's wolf. It relies on stealth. Hiding in the dust, he begins to list them. 12,000 from each tribe. Judah, Reuben, Gad, then Asher, Naphtali, and Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike the heel. A judge brings justice. A serpent brings poison. A judge confronts the rider. A serpent attacks the heel of the horse, relying on chaos to bring the enemy down. Jacob is not just giving a poetic description. He is embedding a profound spiritual warning into the genetic code of the tribe. He is revealing a fatal fracture in their character. Dan will possess the calling, the potential, and the authority to lead, but they will be constantly, relentlessly tempted by the tactics of the serpent's subversion, compromise, and the path of least resistance. This dual nature forces a crucial question. Which path will the descendants of Dan ultimately choose? Will they step into the light and embrace the heavy, difficult responsibility of the judge, or will they sink into the dust and choose the quiet, deadly convenience of the viper? For 400 years in Egyptian slavery, and for 40 years wandering in the wilderness, the prophecy remains dormant. The tribe grows in number, marching under their banner, waiting for their moment. But a prophecy is merely a seed waiting for the right soil. That soil is finally provided when the nation crosses the Jordan River and begins the conquest of the Promised Land. Under the leadership of Joshua, the map is divided, and each tribe is assigned their specific God-given inheritance: Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Most readers let their eyes glide right over this ancient registry. We see a list of 12 names. Dan is handed a stunning, strategically vital piece of territory along the Mediterranean coast. But to possess it, they must first become the judge. They were born to be. They must stand up and fight in the light. Instead, they make a choice that awakens the snake. The Mediterranean sun beats down on the fertile valleys of Canaan. When Joshua unrolls the map and distributes the tribal territories, Dan is handed a masterpiece. Their inheritance includes the lush, rolling plains bordering the sea, intersecting the most vital ancient trade routes of the region. It is a land of deep soil, heavy olive groves, and immense economic potential. But there is a massive obstacle. The plains are already occupied. The Amorites hold the valleys, and the coastal cities are heavily fortified by a rising, terrifying military superpower, the Philistines. Worse still, the enemies in this region possess cutting-edge military technology. They drive chariots fitted with iron scythes. To claim their God-given inheritance, the men of Dan must march down from the high ground, stand in the flat, open plain, and face the iron chariots head-on. They must trust that the God who drowned the chariots of Egypt in the Red Sea can break the iron of the Amorites. They must stand up and become the judge. Instead, the Book of Judges records a devastating failure. We recognize the familiar rhythm of the patriarchs, and we quickly turn the page to the terrifying dragons and falling stars that follow in Judges 1:34. The text delivers a brief but tragic summary. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. Read that sentence carefully. The tribe named God has judged, prophesied to rule and deliver, takes one look at the iron chariots, calculates the personal cost, and retreats into the rocks. They choose the safety of the mountains over the dangerous obedience of the valley. This is not merely a military defeat. It is a spiritual resignation. The familiar interpretation of this moment is that Dan was simply outmatched. The enemy was too strong, the technology too advanced, and the terrain too difficult. But the biblical writer is exposing a deeper, fatal flaw. God did not give Dan an easy assignment. He gave them a highly strategic one. He placed them on the coast as a protective buffer for the rest of the nation. Taking the land required radical, unreasonable faith. Judah faced walled cities and giants in the south and conquered them. Dan faces chariots in the west and surrenders. This is the first strike of the serpent. Dan, abandon the difficult. Divine assignment for the path of least resistance. When you refuse to fight for the territory God has authorized, you inevitably settle for territory He has not. But if you stop and read the registry carefully, a glaring contradiction emerges. One of the original brothers is missing. To maintain the number 12, a tribe cannot survive indefinitely in the cramped, barren rocks of the hill country. They need water. They need pastures for their flocks. They need a home, because they will not fight the Amorites in the light. They must find an enemy they can defeat in the shadows. The tribe begins to look for a softer target, a battle that requires no faith, no sacrifice, and no reliance on God. This single, seemingly pragmatic decision changes the course of biblical history, leaving their God-given borders behind. Dan sends spies hundreds of miles away, to the extreme northern edge of the map. They are searching for a place where the people are quiet. The walls are low, and the iron chariots do not exist. But the choice they make next will introduce a permanent poison into the bloodstream of Israel. 600 armed men from the tribe of Dan leave the barren rocks of their failed inheritance and march north. They bypass the fortified coastal cities, marching for days until they reach the extreme northern edge of the map. Nestled at the lush, green base of Mount Hermon, here, they find a city called Laish. The biblical description of Laish in Judges 18 is haunting. The text says the people lived quiet and secure, that there was no lack of anything that is in the earth, and that they were far from anyone who could come to their rescue. The list elevates Manasseh, one of Joseph's sons, to take a primary slot alongside his father. But a founder of the nation, a legitimate son of Jacob. There are no iron chariots here. There are no massive walls. There are just peaceful, unsuspecting people living by cold mountain springs. They are the perfect prey for a serpent in the dust. The men of Dan do not hesitate. They strike Laish with the sword and burn the quiet city to the ground. They rebuild over the ashes, rename the city Dan, and claim it as their new tribal homeland. Most readers brush past this violent migration as just another ancient battle, but step back and look at the deep spiritual failure occurring. This is not a heroic conquest. It is the ultimate cowardice. When faced with the Amorite armies they were commanded to fight, the tribe of Dan retreated in fear. But when faced with an unarmed, peaceful settlement, they were never authorized to attack. They became ruthless conquerors. They abandoned the holy war God commanded, only to invent a profane war of their own convenience. But the theft of the land is only the secondary crime. The geographical relocation is completely overshadowed by a devastating spiritual theft that occurs along the way. While marching north, the army of Dan passes through the hill country of Ephraim. They come across a house belonging to a man named Micah. Has been entirely erased. There is a blank space on the final scroll where the tribe of Dan should be. The question is not whether inside this house is a private, unauthorized religious shrine, complete with a carved silver idol and a hired rogue priest. The men of Dan simply walk in, take the silver idol, and offer the priest a corporate promotion. They ask him, "Is it better for you to be priest to the house of one man, or to be priest to a tribe and clan in Israel?" The priest gladly accepts the tribal paycheck, packs up the stolen idol, and marches north with the army. Once they arrive in the ashes of Laish, the tribe sets up the carved image for themselves. Do not miss the historical weight of this moment. This is the first time in biblical history that idolatry is institutionalized on a tribal level. They are supposed to travel to the tabernacle in Shiloh to worship the invisible God of the covenant. Instead, they decide that a long journey south is too difficult. It is far easier to build a counterfeit religion in their own backyard. They have officially traded the difficult obedience of God for the cheap convenience of a silver statue. The venom of the serpent is now fully active within the bloodstream of the nation. That would already be a monumental tragedy. But the biblical writer saves the most shocking detail for last.